The Yom Kippur War began in October 1973 with Israel, Golda Meir's cabinet, and the IDF High Command doing what their own security doctrine said you never do. They hesitated. They saw warnings piling up. They sensed movement on two fronts. And still, the reserves were not fully called, the Air Force did not strike first, and the country stayed dangerously close to routine. Within hours, the fast reaction system Israel trusted became a bottleneck. So ask the uncomfortable question. Why would a state built on early warning choose delay when delay could mean collapse? What kind of strategic logic makes inaction feel safer than action? And what happens when an army starts defending not its borders, but its own assumptions? This is not a story about missing intelligence. It's a story about believing the wrong model, on purpose. This episode is not asking why Israel was surprised. That question is too shallow and too comfortable. The real strategic problem is harder and far more unsettling. How did a military system designed around early warning, rapid mobilization, and preemption convince itself that not acting was the most rational choice? How did caution become risk, and restraint become exposure? In October 1973, Israel was not blind. It was watching carefully. It simply chose to interpret what it saw through a framework it trusted more than reality itself. This is why the Yom Kippur War is an unorthodox strategic case. Not because Israel misread Egypt and Syria, but because it deliberately subordinated raw signals to an abstract model of enemy intent. The decision that shaped the opening days of the war was not a battlefield maneuver or a tactical gamble. It was a systemic choice to defend a doctrine. A belief that war could only begin under conditions the model allowed. A belief that mobilizing too early was more dangerous than mobilizing too late. And this belief did not come from arrogance alone. It emerged from past success, political constraint, international pressure, and an internal culture that rewarded coherence over disruption. Once that belief hardened, every warning had to justify itself against it. Not the other way around. This is where strategy turns inward. Where the system stops asking, what is the enemy doing, and starts asking, does this fit what we already know? To understand how a state engineered for speed found itself paralyzed by confidence, we need to reconstruct the strategic environment that made delay feel rational. To understand why hesitation felt rational in October 1973, we have to step away from the battlefield and look at the system Israel had built around war. This was a state that could not afford prolonged campaigns, deep strategic retreats, or slow mobilization. Its defense architecture rested on three pillars: early warning, rapid reserve call-up, and decisive counterattack. Everything else, territory, diplomacy, even manpower, was secondary to speed. If speed failed, the system collapsed. But by 1973, that system carried heavy constraints. Mobilization was not a neutral military act. It froze the economy, signaled escalation to the United States and the Soviet Union, and risked diplomatic isolation. A full call-up without clear proof of enemy intent could fracture Israel's most critical asset, external political support. This meant the warning threshold had quietly shifted. Not officially. Not on paper. But in practice. The system now required certainty, not suspicion. On the other side stood Egypt and Syria, facing their own limits. Neither could defeat Israel in a total war. Their air forces were inferior. Their command structures were rigid. Their strategic depth was limited. But they did not need total victory. They needed rupture. A breach in confidence. A short window where Israel's advantages were neutralized by surprise and simultaneity. Their objective was not annihilation, but shock, psychological, doctrinal, political. This is where the asymmetry became dangerous. Israel read enemy capability. Egypt and Syria read Israeli belief. Israeli intelligence focused on whether Arab forces could win. Arab planners focused on whether Israel believed they would try. That difference mattered more than tanks or aircraft. It meant the battlefield was not the Sinai or the Golan Heights. It was the decision-making loop inside Israeli command. Warnings arrived, but they arrived into a system trained to doubt disruption. Troop movements were interpreted as exercises. Deployments were read as political signaling. Each signal had a plausible explanation that did not require war. And as long as war was deemed irrational for the enemy, every warning had to clear an impossible bar. In that environment, the doctrine meant to guarantee survival quietly transformed into the very constraint that prevented timely action. Israeli military doctrine after 1967 was built on a simple, internally consistent promise. The state would never fight on enemy terms. Early warning would buy time. Reserves would be mobilized before contact. Air superiority would blunt the first blow. Then maneuver would decide the outcome quickly. This model worked because it aligned capability, geography, and political reality. It was elegant. It was proven. And by 1973, it had become unquestioned. Under that doctrine, the correct response to danger was clear. Mobilize early, even at economic cost. Strike first if necessary. Force the enemy to react from a position of weakness. Any deviation from this sequence was treated as recklessness. Ironically, by October 1973, following the doctrine mechanically would have meant doing exactly what leaders now feared most, triggering a war they believed the enemy could not rationally want. Here is the paradox. If Israel mobilized and no attack followed, it would confirm to allies and adversaries that Israeli leadership was jumpy, escalatory, and politically unreliable. If Israel struck first, it risked losing international legitimacy overnight. The doctrine assumed freedom of action. The reality no longer provided it. What once guaranteed survival now carried unacceptable political risk. Most military histories stop here and call this hesitation. That misses the point. This was not indecision. It was a conscious calculation that strict adherence to doctrine might produce a worse strategic outcome than violating it. Leaders were not asking, "What if we are wrong?" They were asking, "What if we are right, and still lose?" The doctrine also contained a hidden assumption rarely stated aloud, that the enemy would behave rationally according to Israeli definitions of rationality. That Egypt and Syria would only attack if they could win decisively. That limited war made no sense. Once that assumption hardened, every warning was filtered through it. Evidence was not evaluated on its own merit. It was evaluated against what the doctrine said was possible. So the system did exactly what it was designed to do. It rejected noise. It enforced coherence. It protected leaders from overreaction. But in doing so, it eliminated the one response the situation demanded: early disruption of the enemy's plan. At this point, the question is no longer what the doctrine said, but how leaders convinced themselves to step outside it without admitting they were gambling. The decision that defined October 1973 did not arrive as a single order or a dramatic moment. It emerged gradually, through alignment rather than debate. No one stood up and argued for delay as a bold strategy. Instead, delay became the default outcome of multiple cautious positions reinforcing each other. Intelligence assessed enemy intent as limited. Political leadership feared international backlash. Military planners trusted that even a late mobilization could still recover the situation. Each position, taken alone, was defensible. Together, they produced paralysis. Inside the system, disagreement existed, but it was muted. Skeptical voices did not challenge the core assumption. They questioned timing, not logic. The dominant belief remained intact: Egypt would not cross the canal without air superiority, and Syria would not move alone. This belief was not treated as a hypothesis. It was treated as a structural fact. Once accepted, it reframed every discussion. Warning indicators were no longer triggers for action. They became anomalies requiring explanation. At the heart of this decision were several fragile assumptions. First, that the enemy shared Israel's definition of success. Second, that limited war was strategically irrational. Third, that Israel's qualitative edge could compensate for lost hours. None of these assumptions were tested under pressure. They were inherited from previous victories and reinforced by institutional memory. The system was not betting blindly. It was betting on continuity. What made this unorthodox was not restraint itself, but confidence in restraint under extreme uncertainty. Israel was not choosing between attack and defense. It was choosing between two types of risk: the visible risk of escalation versus the invisible risk of being wrong. The former felt controllable. The latter felt abstract. And so the system chose to manage perception rather than disruption. This was not a decision aimed at the enemy. It was aimed inward. It protected diplomatic credibility. It preserved political stability. It maintained coherence inside the command structure. In doing so, it delayed the one action the doctrine had been built to guarantee: immediate readiness. Once this choice was locked in, the strategy no longer depended on enemy behavior, but on how long the assumptions could survive contact with reality. Once the shooting started, the gap between the strategy on paper and the situation on the ground became brutally clear. The system had been designed to absorb shock only after mobilization was already underway. Instead, units along the fronts faced concentrated attacks while operating at peacetime strength. Commanders were forced to improvise with incomplete formations, fragmented communications, and limited situational awareness. The doctrine promised recovery through speed, but speed without mass became exhaustion. Mobilization began under fire. Reserves arrived not as a synchronized surge, but in waves, each one too late to prevent the first collapses and too early to reorganize cleanly. Logistics strained immediately. Equipment moved faster than command structures could adapt. Air power, expected to dominate the opening phase, was constrained by surprise, enemy preparation, and the need to prioritize defense over initiative. The margin for error vanished within hours. This was where the unorthodox nature of the earlier decision revealed its true cost. Delay had not merely postponed readiness, it had inverted the sequence of action. Instead of preparation preceding combat, combat now dictated preparation. Every correction was reactive. Every adjustment carried compounding risk. What should have been controlled escalation became damage control under pressure. There were moments when the entire structure threatened to unravel. Local commanders faced choices that doctrine had never prepared them for: hold with insufficient force or withdraw and risk breakthrough. Communications lagged behind events. Intelligence updates arrived too late to inform decisions already taken. The system was not failing because it lacked competence, but because it was being asked to function in reverse. Yet even here, the strategy did not collapse outright. Adaptation followed shock. Improvisation filled gaps doctrine had left open. This is the uncomfortable twist. The same institutional confidence that delayed mobilization also enabled rapid recovery once reality could no longer be denied. The cost, however, had already been paid. Lives, terrain, and time were lost to protect assumptions that no longer held. At this stage, the decisive factor was no longer Israel's choices, but how the enemy interpreted the unfolding chaos and whether they could exploit it correctly. Egyptian and Syrian commanders did not interpret the opening chaos as Israel intended. They saw hesitation not as a trap, but as opportunity. The absence of an immediate counterstrike reinforced their core expectation, that Israel had been caught off balance and would need time to recover. This confirmed the psychological objective of the offensive. The initial crossings and breakthroughs were not meant to be decisive on their own. They were designed to fracture confidence and force Israel into a reactive posture. Yet this is where the enemy also misread the situation. They understood Israeli doctrine well enough to exploit its delay, but not deeply enough to anticipate its recovery under pressure. Once mobilization reached critical mass, the same institutional discipline that had delayed action now enabled rapid reorganization. The enemy's operational plans assumed Israel would either respond immediately or remain paralyzed longer than it did. There was little preparation for a third scenario: delayed shock followed by aggressive adaptation. Command structures on the Arab side were built to execute a plan, not to revise it dynamically. Early success reinforced caution rather than boldness. Opportunities to push deeper were weighed against political and logistical limits. This restraint, rational in isolation, proved costly in context. The window created by Israeli hesitation began to close faster than anticipated. Information lagged on both sides, but asymmetrically. Israeli commanders learned through loss and adjustment. Arab commanders relied on pre-war assumptions about Israeli thresholds. The very logic that enabled the surprise now constrained exploitation. What began as a psychological victory risked becoming a strategic stalemate. This exchange of miscalculations reveals the deeper truth of the war's opening phase. Both sides were fighting models as much as forces. Each interpreted events through expectations formed long before the first shots were fired. The difference lay in flexibility under stress. With the immediate crisis contained but not erased, the final measure of the strategy would not be victory or defeat, but the cost it imposed on every level of the system. By the time the front stabilized, Israel had regained operational initiative. Counteroffensives shifted momentum. The immediate threat to national survival receded. From a distance, this looks like recovery. From inside the system, it felt like survival by margin. The strategy of delay did not fail completely, but it failed precisely where it was most dangerous, at the opening moment when error could not be absorbed. The human cost was immediate and uneven. Units deployed forward absorbed losses that Doctrine had been designed to prevent. Soldiers fought without depth, without reserves, without the advantage of preparation. These losses were not the price of defeat. They were the price of protecting a belief for too long. Logistically, the system paid in compression. Mobilization under fire forced shortcuts. Equipment arrived without cohesion. Command decisions were made with partial awareness. The army adapted, but adaptation under pressure always costs more than preparation. What should have been an orderly transition became a race to prevent cascading failure. Politically, the cost lingered far longer than the fighting. Trust in leadership fractured. Investigations followed. The myth of infallibility collapsed. For a state built on the idea that it could never be strategically surprised, this was not a temporary wound. It was a structural shock. The most enduring cost was psychological. For decision-makers, the question never went away. Was restraint necessary, or was it rationalization? Was the gamble unavoidable, or was it chosen because it was easier to defend internally than decisive action? The war ended, but the doubt remained. This is why the Yom Kippur War cannot be reduced to victory or defeat. The strategy achieved recovery, but at a cost that reshaped doctrine, politics, and collective memory. To understand why this case still matters, we have to move beyond outcomes and isolate the principles it exposed about power, belief, and strategic blindness. The Yom Kippur War is often explained as a failure of warning. That explanation is convenient, but incomplete. The deeper reality is that this war exposed how strategic systems fail not when they lack information, but when they protect coherence at the expense of disruption. Israel did not underestimate its enemies. It overestimated the stability of its own assumptions. The decision to delay action was not ignorance. It was a form of risk management that treated political legitimacy, alliance stability, and internal consensus as variables equal to military readiness. This strategy broke a foundational rule of military planning, that uncertainty demands action, not restraint. Yet it replaced that rule with another, rarely articulated principle. That credibility can be as decisive as firepower. That once lost, it cannot be easily recovered. Israel's leadership chose to preserve credibility externally, even if it meant gambling internally. That choice was not irrational. It was fragile. The first lesson is uncomfortable. Doctrines that succeed too well become invisible. They stop being tools and start becoming truths. Once that happens, evidence is no longer evaluated on its own terms. It is judged by whether it threatens the system's internal logic. In 1973, the Israeli system did exactly what it had been optimized to do. It filtered noise. It avoided panic. It maintained political alignment. And in doing so, it delayed the one action it was designed to guarantee. The second lesson is structural. Strategic failure rarely announces itself as error. It arrives as consensus, as alignment, as calm agreement among intelligent actors who share the same assumptions. By the time dissent becomes visible, the cost of acting has already increased. What looks like unity can be fragility in disguise. The final lesson is the hardest. Unorthodox strategies are not defined by bold moves, but by what they choose not to do. In 1973, Israel's most consequential action was restraint. Not because restraint was safe, but because it felt defensible. This war reminds us that the most dangerous strategies are often the ones that feel reasonable to everyone involved. And that is why the Yom Kippur War endures, not as a story of surprise, but as a warning about how power blinds itself. The Yom Kippur War did not overturn Israeli military power. It overturned certainty. What collapsed in October 1973 was not the army, but the belief that a superior system could always see danger in time to avoid it. The strategy of delay was not madness. It was logic taken too far, confidence stretched beyond its limits, and coherence defended longer than reality allowed. This is why the war still matters. Not because Israel was surprised, but because it chose to wait. Not because intelligence failed, but because belief succeeded too well. The most unsettling lesson is not that assumptions can be wrong. It is that they can remain convincing right up until the moment they become lethal. Every strategic system eventually faces this test. The moment when acting feels reckless, and not acting feels responsible. The Yom Kippur War shows what happens when that balance breaks. When restraint becomes a shield for doctrine. When delay becomes the cost of preserving internal order. When power blinds itself by trusting its own logic more than the signals in front of it. This was not an accident of history. It was a pattern. And patterns repeat, long after the names, uniforms, and borders have changed.